Well, thank you and good afternoon. It's really great to be here. And it's especially great to be here to talk about the issue of productivity and economic growth in Canada. I think economically, there is no more significant and no more pressing issue than this. And there's a lot to unpack and explore. And so I understand I do have 3 hours or so of your time to go through these issues with you. No, 20 or 30 minutes. So it'll be at a high level, but hopefully I'll showcase some of the data that leads me to have a concern about Canada's economic performance in recent years, but also end on an optimistic note around potential policy options that we have to improve the situation. All right, so I'll just set the stage with a simple measure of economic performance in Canada directly related to productivity, and that's GDP per capita. So GDP is just the amount of goods and services that are being produced each year, and per capita is just per person, how much are we producing each year in total goods and services. And notice recently, seen a decline in GDP per capita relative to where we were last year, the year before. So we've had 3 consecutive years in a row of negative productivity growth. We're back now to a level that is roughly comparable to where we were in 2016. So we have stagnated by this measure economically. We're just not producing any more per person than we were nearly a decade ago. And it's not something that afflicts economies everywhere. It is something that some economies are experiencing, but Canada's uniquely experiencing to the degree that it is. And one important comparator is the United States. So in blue, you have the same measure here of GDP per capita of the United States over the same span of time. Notice, starting around 2015, a sharp divergence between the two economies. And it is not something unique to just the period after 2010. If I go back even earlier, here in 1995 to 2015, the two economies moved in lockstep with each other, rising together, falling together during recessions, rising again during recoveries. But after 2015, something unique happens where we diverge. Canada stagnates and the United States continues, even after COVID, along its pre-COVID trajectory. And to give you a sense of scale, this divergence that we're seeing between the two countries is equivalent to about $640 billion a year in foregone economic output. Had we just kept pace with the United States since 2015, the economy today would be about 21% larger. And that gap, it has widened very rapidly, and it's widened to a level that we haven't seen in generations. This year, the United States is on track to produce approximately 50% more per person than Canada. 50% more economic output per person in the United States than Canada. And here I'm plotting a measure of that gap between Canada and the United States since Confederation. Notice that prior to the last several years, a kind of typical gap that we observed was about 25%. And over this whole span of time, the US has always produced more per person than Canada. But the 50% larger amount that they produced this year is larger than any point since World War II. And that was just a blip in that particular year. Same with the blip that we saw in the Great Depression and World War I. So if you strip out the World Wars and the Great Depression, Canada hasn't seen the economic gap between us and the United States as wide as it is now since the days of John A. Macdonald. This is the productivity challenge that we have. Now, not all parts of Canada are experiencing it in the same way. Different parts of the country have stronger or weaker economies, and that is true also in the United States. And so another comparison that I think illustrates the economic and productivity challenge that Canada faces is by comparing provincial economies with state-level economies. And here I do that for 2023. This is unfortunately the most recent data that we have at this level. And you can see that Alberta and Saskatchewan do outperform other provinces in terms of their GDP per capita were roughly comparable to what you observe in Texas, for example, so higher than the United States average. But notice Atlantic Canada, far below, in fact, every other state, below Mississippi. Or look at Ontario, the largest by scale economy in Canada. It has a level of GDP per capita that is roughly equivalent to what we see in Alabama. There is, I think, an economic challenge here. The amount that we produce per person, our productivity, our ability to make goods and services, is behind improvements in standards of living. It's behind the purchasing power of our income. It's behind having the resources available to our governments to deliver critical public services. Low productivity growth, slow economic growth has implications right across the country. Now, if you don't like the Canada-US comparison, and some don't, as an aside, I do like the Canada-US comparison. They are by far our largest trading partner, and so understanding and appreciating our relative position to them matters. The most important comparison in terms of our competitiveness. It's also the location that many Canadians move to. If they have marketable skills and opportunities are greater there, then we would tend to see more Canadians leave. So this comparison is relevant at an individual level, it's relevant at a business level. But if you don't like it, let's just compare Canada to ourselves. We were on a trajectory prior to COVID of economic growth, slower than historical rates, but following COVID, we haven't returned yet to our pre-COVID trajectory. The United States has, but right now Canada's about 7% smaller than it would have been had all we done is continued on our previous trajectory. Now, normally following recessions, and of course COVID was a unique kind of contraction and disruption, but normally following a contraction of economic activity, you have a period of recovery back to trend. You have a period of faster than normal economic growth, which we did not see. And the reason for this is twofold. One is we do have an aging population, falling labor force participation rates. That does mean, all else equal, slower economic growth. And that's a non-trivial challenge for the country, but it's not new. The other piece is productivity. It's not about working harder, working longer for less money. It's about getting more for each hour that we produce. And when you decompose the causes, or you just do an accounting exercise and ask what fraction of the gap between where Canada is now and where it would have been had we kept on our previous trajectory, you see that about 70% of that gap is just due to productivity lagging. Not just slow growth, but negative productivity growth. Interestingly, this morning, Statistics Canada released their latest third quarter of 2024 labor productivity data, and it was again negative. Quarter after quarter, productivity is falling. Now, why is that? There's lots of different ways to unpack this data, and I think looking at different sectors is a very useful one to look at, and I'm going to do that here. So think about the last 10 years or so. So since 2015, what has productivity growth looked like in different major sectors of the Canadian economy? In red, these are sectors where productivity growth has been negative on average. Notice construction, where we have about, on average, a 1.5% per year reduction in productivity since 2015. A significant contraction. Now, what was the productivity growth in these sectors prior to 2015, so that 1995 to 2015 period that we saw earlier? Well, I'll put those in black dots here. There you go. There was a lot more consistency in productivity growth across sectors in that prior 20-year period. But notice construction. Again, it's not just shrinking. It is far, far below what its pre-2015 rate of productivity growth was. Notice mining, oil, and gas, and I have noticed a few articles, sometimes a Globe and Mail op-ed or two on the question of what's driving low productivity growth, and some make the case that it's because of oil and gas. And indeed, prior to 2015, the sector with the slowest productivity growth was mining, oil, and gas. See, as the black, you might have to squint actually, depending on where you're sitting in the room, but take my word for it that it was the lowest productivity growth in that particular sector. But since 2015, it's now outperforming the rate of productivity growth in that 20-year previous period. And so our recent experience is not because of slow productivity growth in mining, oil, and gas. It's because of construction. It's because of transportation and warehousing, and it's because of manufacturing. And in fact, if you ask what would productivity and growth in Canada be if sectors just kept at their pre-2015 normal rate of growth, then we would see that productivity growth would be nearly 1% per year if just construction, transportation, and manufacturing kept at their pre-2015 rates of productivity growth. Look at construction alone. So in red, since 2015, we've been averaging about 0.2% per year in growth. If construction would have just kept its own historical rate of productivity growth, then we would have a near tripling of the aggregate national labor productivity growth rate, just from construction alone. Now, I'm not an expert in that particular sector or in transportation or manufacturing techniques and processes. Many others in the room may be, but just the data says that our problem is really concentrated in those three sectors. And construction is not just an important sector because it itself is a pretty large sector, but it contributes to the success of almost every other area of the economy. Think about infrastructure that facilitates activity everywhere. Okay, construction is behind that. Think about our housing challenges. Construction is behind that. Improving productivity growth there is not just something that contributes to growth in the whole, but it has spillover implications right across the economy. Okay, so we have a problem. But does GDP per capita, does labor productivity matter? I want to maybe convince you, if you weren't already of the view that it does, I want to convince you that it does because it translates directly into living standards. It translates directly into how much we can buy with the income that we have. It matters for prices. It matters for income levels and wages overall. And some might look at a graph like this and say, well, maybe GDP per capita mattered for, say, real inflation-adjusted earnings historically, but there's been a sharp separation between GDP per capita and real weekly earnings from about the late 1970s onwards. Now, GDP is itself a measure of the overall amount of income that we're generating in a particular year. And not all of that income is going to flow to workers through wages and salaries. A lot of it will flow also to owners of capital. The returns to investment takes a share of that. But if we look in recent years, we have GDP per capita since the late 1990s. It is different than real weekly earnings, but there are different measures to keep in mind to better link productivity with income levels. First, we have a couple different measures of income. So we have a payroll data that StatCan uses administrative data to estimate what the average job is generating in terms of earnings per week. We also have a labor force survey where we're asking people, how much do you normally make? And those two data sets paint a very different picture. So when you ask people how much they make, it looks better than just the payroll side of things alone. Part of this might be multiple jobs. So in the payroll data, we can't tell if it's the same person with two jobs. But when we ask them, we get a better sense of their situation. Now, both of these measures also exclude other types of income that laborers are compensated for their work. Think about benefits. Think about pensions. Think about all sorts of other ways that we compensate labor. And if you look at the whole picture of labor compensation in orange and look at that per hour worked, now it tracks pretty closely with productivity. So productivity drives changes in income. And you do have to think about how you're measuring income, but over long spans of time, GDP per capita, labor productivity, total hourly compensation for workers, all adjusted for inflation, they move together. Productivity matters because it's behind changes in our standards of living. You can also see that there's a problem even putting aside GDP per capita or labor productivity data and just ask the data, how quickly are inflation-adjusted disposable incomes of Canadians growing over the past few years? And if you look at the typical 8-year period of growth, and that's in this most recent period, the 2015 to 2023, we haven't seen an 8-year period with slower inflation-adjusted disposable income growth now, with only 2 exceptions: the Great Depression and the 1990s recession. And the 1990s recession was a very significant recession, deep and long-lasting in Canada. Nicole Fortana, a really top macroeconomist in Canada, labeled it the Great Canadian Slump. And that's kind of where I'm stealing the title of today's talk from, the Great Canadian Productivity Slump. That recession is roughly comparable to the situation we're experiencing now, but we're not in a recession. So we're not experiencing a low growth of disposable income because jobs are being lost. We're experiencing a slow growth in disposable income because productivity growth is so slow. It's not just about inflation. Look at the 1970s and early 1980s, where we had very robust growth in disposable income, and this is adjusted for inflation. But today's experience, it's not about job losses, not about inflation, it's all about productivity. Now, if you ask Canadians whether they're concerned about productivity, most of them will, first of all, most of them will not quite know what you're referring to. Abacus did a poll recently that they kind of released in October, asking people whether they were aware of Canada's slow growth in productivity, and only 9% said yes. But an economic concern that is top of mind for many is, of course, affordability, prices. And productivity is behind this as well. So what are average consumer prices in Canada today? Well, they're about 7% higher now than they would have been had we had the same normal 2% inflation over the past several years. Now, it's not a fluke that prices are about 7% higher than they would have been had times continued to be normal. And recall that our economy, GDP, is about 7% smaller than it would have been had things just continued on in their pre-COVID trajectory. Productivity translates into prices as well. So behind our affordability challenges is the productivity issue that Canadians are grappling with. So given the time, I'm going to skip through those and turn now to maybe the optimistic part of the talk. Now, despite all the sheer scale of the challenge that we face, I think there are a lot of options to improve the situation. And I think we are entering a unique moment next year where some potentially significant policy change may occur, potentially and optimistically for the better. Now, I'll note that not everything is rosy on the horizon. There are some real risks economically, and there are a lot of policy issues that can be very disruptive to the economy that are outside of our direct control. As most recently, of course, the tweet heard around the world of 25% being levied on imports by the United States from Canada and Mexico, in addition to increased tariffs levied on imports from China, in addition to across-the-board tariffs potentially literally levied by the United States on imports from everywhere. And, it probably doesn't even need saying in a room like this, but that matters for Canada, perhaps more than many other economies, simply because Canada-US trade is so important for Canada's economy. There we go. It's roughly equivalent to about 1/3 of economic activity. So a 25% tariff on that amount of economic activity in Canada has huge implications. And Canada-US trade matters a lot more for us than it does for them. The equivalent share of their economy accounted for by Canada-US trade is about 3%. So there will, of course, be economic disruptions in the United States from tariffs of that scale. It's not just about the raw trade volumes between the two economies, it's also about what we trade. And what we trade between these two countries is largely intermediate inputs and capital goods. And so there would be very significant supply chain implications of these tariffs throughout the United States, affecting businesses there, even that don't directly engage in trade. It would also significantly disrupt multinational production that crosses the border. More than half of Canada-US trade actually occurs within the same firm, where you have one entity in Canada and another in the United States, either the head office in the United States or a subsidiary, depending on where the headquarters is located, but trade volumes just between the same parts of the same company. In oil and gas, it's about 2/3. The tariff would apply to those transactions just like any other, potentially having significant implications for decisions that companies take over where to locate facilities in that supply chain. So all that is to say that a tariff would be disruptive for Canada. It would also be disruptive for the United States. Now, how disruptive? This is something where estimates are now coming out and they will be refined over time. All of them are, at the moment, no doubt wrong, because we're just going based on off of a tweet, and the details will matter. How countries retaliate will also matter. But at the risk of, I guess, putting myself out there, I've done some work with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that examines the importance of the Canada-US trading relationship in general. We did release this paper through the Chamber last month called Partners in Prosperity, if you were to Google that. Now, unfortunately, we simulated a 10% tariff, so the paper itself is a little dated, but we've updated the analysis there, and this is kind of the implications for Canada. If we just take it and don't retaliate at all, that 25% tariff would shrink the economy by just shy of 2%. That's a lot. That's a $60 billion, give or take, per year hit in terms of foregone economic activity. That's significant. Depending on how we retaliate, those costs will grow. Of course, the costs will also grow in the United States too, and so that's a tough decision of whether or how to retaliate. If we retaliate in full with our own 25% across the board tariff on imports from them, which I think would be unwise, but I do want to just highlight this scenario for you, then the economy here would shrink by about 2.6%. Those are big numbers. That's getting you into the range of a typical recession in terms of the amount of contraction that we see. So just this tariff alone is a recession. That's kind of the order of magnitude you should have in mind. A normal recession. Now, there's reasons to think this is maybe an underestimate, because it's not just a clean imposition of a tariff. There's going to be a lot of chaos and uncertainty along the way, and that's going to naturally lead to a lot of major investment decisions to prudently perhaps pause, amplifying the short-term economic costs of these measures. So think about these as the long-term implications. They're significant. But in the face even of that, there are a lot of options that we can do, not just to offset those losses, but even grow beyond them. And we explored through an event that the School of Public Policy hosted, sponsored by the Government of Alberta, partnered with the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. So thank you, Dab, and the Business Council of Alberta. I'm not sure if Adam's here, but thanks to him if he is. And it was a really a fabulous event of about 700 people at peak discussing what to do about the productivity challenge. The existence of the problem, that's clear. What do we do about it? And we explored lots of different areas, different focus on policy issues, from taxes to trade to infrastructure and more, different focuses on various sectors as well. I won't go through all of what we heard at that summit. I'll just highlight a couple of potential options that might spark some conversations or reflections among you later today. And I'll start there in the top: taxes and regulations. Now, this This is always a significant area of public policy that has implications for overall investment levels. That's true always, but I think now much more important that we get this area right. Tax changes in the United States will potentially lower our overall level of competitiveness compared to them. If they do enact changes that see business taxes drop to 15%, combined with 100% expensing on capital investment in the United States, that will lead to a very large gap in the rate of taxation that we're applying to investment in Canada or to business activity. They would have almost half of the tax rate that Canada does. And so we need to think about responding to that inevitable change. I think part of that might just be simple things, maybe not even lowering the corporate tax rate itself federally, but allowing for 100% expensing of equipment and capital investments by firms. That would dramatically lower the tax that we're implicitly placing on investment without necessarily changing the, without necessarily changing the tax rate itself. Another area that would lead to significant benefits is internal trade. Now, I mention that because it's an area of research for me, but it was the single most frequently referred to issue throughout the whole summit in session after session after session. There's uncertainty and disruptions in the global trading environment, but our own economic union is far weaker than it could be. The ability of companies to operate across provincial boundaries, sell across provincial boundaries, the ability of individuals to move across provincial boundaries is dramatically hindered. There we go. Awesome. Good. Dramatically hindered by differences in rules and regulations that exist in one province to the next. And my own estimates here, and of course it depends on how you conduct the analysis, but to give you a sense of scale, the existence of these barriers between provinces shrink our overall economy by the equivalent of 5, maybe 7% at the high end. So a quarter to a third of the entire widened gap between Canada and the United States could be eliminated just by getting our own internal market in order. And this is a policy area that is much more important for provinces, because most of these barriers are just about our rules being different than what exists in other jurisdictions. Now, given the room, I'd be remiss in noting that finance is one of these important sectors where rules can be quite different in different parts of the country, and finance is a critically important input supplier into every sector of the economy. Harmonizing rules and regulations, having jurisdictions just unilaterally recognize rules and regulations that exist elsewhere would move the needle on this. So I think it's time that provinces and premiers start to prioritize this issue. So I'm already a little over time, and so I'll just conclude by noting that the very bottom left here, perhaps the most boring, but maybe the most significant over time, would be to really put productivity and economic growth at the center of our policy making process. And if we're making decisions about anything, stop and think what that would do to economic growth, what that would do to productivity. And that could be done by governments unilaterally. It can be done by businesses or industry associations engaging with government, always highlighting what the productivity and growth implications are. Maybe it could be facilitating by creating a national productivity commission. Many countries, almost every EU country, for example, has one. I believe the United Kingdom has one as well. We used to, in the 1950s, early 1960s, have a National Productivity Commission. And so maybe it's time to bring something like that back to keep productivity and growth at the center of the agenda. But I think on that note, I will conclude and thank you for your time and attention today. And hopefully this was in part sobering, but also maybe ending on that optimistic note as well. So thank you.